If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Acts chapter 10. Chapter 10, this is where we'll spend our time today. One of the challenges that comes to us as believers from those who don't believe, and it's a valid question. What about people who are too remote to ever have occasion to hear the gospel? What of them? What if they are genuinely seeking to know the truth about something like this, about salvation, about who God is? Can they know Him? Can they be brought into right relationship with Him? There are people, rightly so, there are people who are in far-flung regions of the earth who are never going to have the missionary come to them necessarily, or somebody come to them and deliver the gospel. They don't have Bibles, they don't have access to any of these things. What about them? Let's look at this text today, and I think we'll find that the Bible gives to us the answer to this challenge. In chapter 10, verse 1, there was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of what is known as the Italian regiment, a devout man and one who feared God with all of his household, who gave alms generously to all of the people and prayed to God always. About the 9th hour, or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God coming in and saying to him, "Cornelius." When Cornelius observed the angel, he was afraid and said, "What is it, Lord?" So the angel said to him, "Your prayers and your alms have come up for a memorial before God. Now send men to Joppa and send for Simon, whose surname is Peter. He is lodging with Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the sea. Peter will tell you what you must do." When the angel who spoke to him had departed, Cornelius called 2 of his household servants and a devout soldier from among those who waited on him continually. And so when he had explained all that had happened to them, he sent them to Joppa. Now here is exactly what I referred to in the opening. God is intervening on behalf of somebody who doesn't even know what to ask for. I mean, as far as the Bible is concerned, Cornelius is the first real pagan Gentile convert that we know of. From among, as the Jews would have referred to it at this time in history, the Goyim, the nations. He's stationed at Caesarea, which is the Roman capital of Palestine and Judea. Now, of course, for the Jew, the capital would be Jerusalem. But as far as the Roman government was concerned, it was Caesarea. And there was a large contingent of soldiers stationed at the capital, as there were in many parts of the Roman Empire. And it was called, as the text says here, the Italian regiment, or an Italian legion. What was that? Well, it was 6,000 troops, divided up into 10 cohorts of 600 each, which would be divided into 6 centuries of 100 troops apiece. Cornelius was in charge of one of those centuries. He was a centurion, from which we get our word century, or 100. The life of the centurion was one of absolute loyalty. Now, as I was preparing for this sermon, I found a text by a Roman historian that spoke to what would be the qualifications one might find in a person who would be chosen by the Roman army as a centurion. And here's how the Roman historian listed it. He said, "A centurion is desired not to be overbold or reckless, as much as a good leader, of steady and prudent mind, not prone to take the offensive to start fighting wantonly, but able, when overwhelmed and hard-pressed, to stand fast and be willing to die at their post." So this is a very thoughtful person. Cornelius is not someone who is whimsical and given to frivolity and who is rash. He is a calculating, thoughtful person who has, for whatever reason, come to Judaism. Now, I can think of all kinds of reasons at this time in history, when all of this is taking place, why that would happen. The Bible lists him as a God-fearer. And that was a very specific category in Judaism. It meant that you did not have to observe the kosher laws at all. That meant circumcision and all of the dietary restrictions. But you did attend a synagogue or temple. And you were a participant in the services. And you believed in the one God the maker of heaven and earth. And usually this would happen because at this time in history, just as in the time, say, of Socrates, Socrates got himself in trouble by questioning, part of what got him executed was questioning the Greek pantheon, the Greek gods. And he said, look, these guys are worse than we are. These gods and goddesses behave, I would never raise a child to behave this way, and yet we're calling them gods and goddesses. There must be, because I know what right and wrong is and I know the good, there must be a God who's behind all of this. And that got Socrates, had to drink the hemlock and put himself to death. Well, that's not a new development, that people would grow weary of these human contrived gods, deities. And suddenly they would dawn on people that, gosh, there must be someone who made all of this, someone who is truly good, because I know what good is, and I know that these deities we're talking about aren't. And I look at some of the practices of some of the followers, and I recognize those aren't good either. There's got to be a way that is good. There must be a God. And this would be Cornelius. He was, according to all of the light that he had, reaching out to the God that he didn't know. He was reaching out. He is at the crossroad between Judaism and Jesus. He doesn't know any of this, of course. But it makes me wonder that in our day, certainly there must be many Jewish people at this same crossroad between Judaism and Jesus, wondering, has the Messiah actually come? I mean, so much of that is contingent on how we as Christians live before them, and our track record is not that great. The Bible calls Cornelius Eusebius, devout. There's a church historian, just as a side note, it's very interesting. Names mean things to most people. I mean, you choose, I don't know what my name means, Rip. I mean, what does that mean? I have no idea. But most names mean something. Most names. And Eusebius, devout, we have a church historian from the 4th century by the name of Eusebius, the devout one. That's exactly what his name means. Now, Peter has a vision. So let's pick the text up right at Peter's vision in verse 9. The next day, as they went on their journey and drew near the city, Peter went up on the housetop to pray about the 6th hour. These people are coming from Caesarea to Joppa. Peter became very hungry and wanted to eat, but while they made ready, he fell into a trance and saw heaven opened and an object like a great sheet bound at the 4 corners descending to him and let down to the earth. In it were all kinds of 4-footed animals of the earth, wild beasts, creeping things, and birds of the air. A voice came to Peter and said, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything common or unclean." A voice spoke to him again the second time, "What God has cleansed you must not call common." This was done 3 times, and then the object was taken back up into heaven again. Well, God is intervening once again, but now he's intervening with Peter. He is changing Peter. Peter's Judaism, his worldview, is fixing to be rocked, and it is being rocked by this vision. He's about to have all of his Jewish understanding, all the tradition and the history in which he has been raised, undone. Now, God alone could do this. I don't think anybody could have talked Peter into this. But it raises some questions, doesn't it? I mean, if we're thinking people, it raises a question. The question that comes to my mind is, is God reversing all that he commanded? We believe that God is immutable, that he doesn't change in these intrinsic ways. Well, this looks pretty intrinsic. I mean, if you've commanded these people for 2,000 or 1,800 years roughly to this point in history, call it 1,500 since Moses was given the law, and you've told them what to eat and not to eat, and now you're going to reverse that, does that sound immutable? It sounds to me like you've changed your mind. What's going on? You have to realize there are 3 types of law. This is what we have to realize. 3 types of law. There was the ceremonial, there was the civic, and there was the moral. By this time in history, of course, they were still holding on to the ceremonial. Much of the civic had gone away. Much of the civic law at this point had gone away. That's proper that it should go away. But what they didn't realize was that these restrictions and dietary things were strictly ceremonial. They were ceremonial. Why were they there? They were to make the Jews a separated people, not in terms of their humanity, but in terms of their devotion to Yahweh. It was a way of teaching devotion. It was a way of teaching that you are called out from among all the nations to be different, not so that you're privileged. You see, the ceremonial was preparatory. It wasn't permanent. It was preparatory. I mean, Peter's already staying with Simon the tanner. Tanners were unclean. Go back to Numbers 19, read about it. Tanners were to live at a certain spot outside the town. They were unclean. Why? Because they handled dead stuff, dead animals, carcasses. That was their whole gig. So they were always unclean. Well, Peter goes up on the roof. Now that's significant. That tells us a lot about these little homes that were in Palestine. They were basically one room. And so if you wanted some privacy, you had to go out of the room because everybody's in the room. You remember Jesus is speaking about the man who comes to the door and begs for bread at night. I'm out of bread. I've got guests. Can you give me some? And the owner of the home keeps telling him to go away. You know why that story makes so much sense to them and not to us? Because at that time in history, when it was time to go to bed, you set up a lamp in the middle of the room, and everybody in the room was on the floor sleeping. The whole family, all in one room. So if somebody came to the door, you woke up the whole family. Everybody was disturbed in their sleep. This is why this story would be so significant, as Jesus told it at that time. So Peter goes up where he can find some privacy. He wants to be alone. He wants to pray. And during that time of prayer, of course, God meets him there. Now, the prejudice against the Goyim, which is what God is working at here, it was so powerful for the Jewish person at this time in history. It was so deeply ingrained and so difficult for them to see any other way. If you go through further in the book of Acts, you'll see every time the word Gentile comes up, there's a riot. Poor Paul. I mean, every time he goes to speak to people, he mentions Gentiles, there's a riot. Well, that, as I've pointed out in sermons prior, that is not without precedent. There is a reason for this. The Jews, one of the viewpoints of the Goyim, the nations that the Jews had, was that they were God's hammer. Unwittingly, but they were God's hammer. God used the Gentile nations to bring judgment to the Jews, to chastise them. If you read Deuteronomy chapter 28, which I have encouraged prior, everybody should read that chapter to understand why Paul felt the way he did as Saul and why this Jewish prejudice was so deep. Yahweh will bring a nation against you from afar, from the ends of the earth as the eagle flies, a nation whose language you will not understand. Why? To judge you. And so that was the picture of the Goyim. A Gentile woman would not receive help from a Jew in childbirth. Why? Because if you helped them, you were letting one more Gentile be born into the world. So this was a very deep prejudice. The word neighbor was a legal term to the Jew. Remember Jesus, Jesus in his speech regarding the Samaritan, how does it start out? The lawyer says, "Who's my neighbor?" That was a legal term. And if you weren't a neighbor, as far as the Jews were concerned, that they weren't obligated to help you in any way. Gentiles were not neighbors. They were, as the Jews referred to them, fuel for the fires of hell and nothing more. Isn't that odd, though, when you think about it? It shows a misunderstanding of the Jewish law. It also shows a misunderstanding of the ceremonial aspects of the law versus the moral. And it shows a misunderstanding of lineage. I mean, after all, according to the Jewish texts, all of humanity comes from two wayward gardeners and a drunk sea captain, right? So we're all of the same stock. So how did this prejudice come about to be so deeply ingrained? Well, God is going to demonstrate to Peter just what it really means. He is going to use something very common, food. And he's going to begin to change Peter into someone who understands what God is actually doing on the earth via the cross and the resurrection. The dietary restrictions were a place of great change, but they're a place where you can actually begin to change without it being too severe. God is so clever in the way in which he does this. He doesn't take something of their personhood as Jews that would be impossible to move. He starts with something that would be a little lighter in weight. Cornelius was devout. That tells us something about ourselves today. And I want to funnel this down to a couple of thoughts for you and me today so that the text has relevance. What does it mean to be devout? Well, you go back and read the text. I mean, it says very clearly that Cornelius prayed, he gave alms, he was generous, he was a God-fearer. That meant he attended services in the synagogue or the temple. Well, here we are at Christmas time. Everybody's feeling kind of devout, aren't they? I mean, churches generally at Christmas, there'll be more people there because they're feeling all of the sentimentality that comes about with Christmas, and they're feeling good. And let's go be at a church and hear some Christmas carols and sit with other believers. That's all fine and dandy, but there's a big difference between devotion and salvation. A big difference. Salvation is a very different thing. Cornelius, with all of his devotion, is praying, but what's he praying for? He knows not what. You see, he was praying to earn favor with God, just like any good Jew. He's praying for something he doesn't know that he even needs, and God is intervening to bring him to his unknown neediness. He's bringing it to him. Now, this angel appears to Cornelius. That's very different than Peter's trance. Cornelius is wide awake. He's fully himself. And you have to wonder why the angel just doesn't tell Cornelius about salvation. Well, there's a reason for that. Humans are the only ones that know about it. We're the ones who get saved. We're the ones who God saves. He doesn't save angels. So in order for that communication to take place, you need a human to do it. The angel's not really set up for that. And God sends Peter. God sends Peter. One of the aspects of this that's so tied to the Old Testament and Judaism is Psalm 141, wherein the text says prayers are an offering. You see, Cornelius was offering alms. Cornelius was devout. He was attending, but he was also offering to God prayers. And he was sent an answer to his prayer. There is something so potent here. Don't worry about the person out in the bush who may never be exposed to the gospel in a direct way. If they are seeking God, God will be found. God will always answer the prayer for salvation. Jeremiah 29 says it. Acts 17 says it. God would send someone to respond to someone's earnest seeking. The angel prepared the meeting, set it all up. Cornelius praying, making his offerings to God as a good Jewish convert to make way for himself via God's favor. Well, hey, Philip is in town. Why don't we just send Philip? Now there's a plan, but you see, Philip is a Greek Jew. God wants to send somebody who is an ethnic Jew, born to a tribe of Jews, steeped in Judaism, never knowing anything else but Judaism. So he sends Peter. Why? Because the walls have to come down. The wall has to come down. Peter invites Romans into his home. He's going to. He is going to be invited into a Roman home. But just as Paul says in Romans chapter 10, there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all and richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Now I'm funneling all this down to one story here. Cornelius is praying to understand his duty to God. He doesn't realize that his duty is to believe on him whom God has sent. John chapter 6. I have a friend who was very devout. Very devout. Grew up in a church denomination structure that I'll not name. He was raised by a believing mother. His father had died when he was 12, but all through his life, his believing mother had faithfully, she was the secretary of this church as a matter of fact, had faithfully attended, had taken my friend with her to the congregational settings. Well, in that situation, as they found themselves, this child grew up knowing the church well. Within this particular denomination, there was what was known as the catechism. That is, you would be taught these various believers' facts about what it is Christianity is according to that denominational structure's understanding, which was very orthodox. And if you could come before the congregation after a certain age, 12, and recite the catechism and answer all the questions, you were made a member of that denomination. And my friend, who had been there every time the doors were cracked open with his mother, did that, and he was in. Well, this didn't put the fire out for him. This lit the fire up. He was there for everything. He attended everything. He went on all the ski trips. He went to the youth groups. He went to the hot dog cookouts. He went to all of the fundraisers and the car washes. Everything about this denominational structure he could participate in, he was there. And he wasn't just showing up. He was one of the main leaders and participants. Well, he went to college and he wanted to go to a Christian college. And so once he got to this Christian college, of course, still burning with his devotion, he wanted to join one of the parachurch groups on the college, and he did, Campus Crusade. And he went to one of the meetings, and one of the people there, the leaders, related the gospel. What a jolt, figuring, gosh, at a college thing, there got to be some unbelievers here. And my friend, who now was 12 years into his devotional life, and counting his childhood, the whole of his life, realized he had never come to Jesus and asked to be saved. He never had come to that place where he had bent that knee. He was 20-something years old and suddenly realized, I'm not even a follower. I'm not a believer. Very devout, very faithful, hyper-faithful, just like Cornelius and just like some of us, who because of our devotion think ourselves believers, but we've never bent that knee. We've never bent that knee. What is our story today? I don't know where everybody is, but if I've said anything about which you have a question, you want to speak with me, I'll stay as long as it takes as we close.